All right, so I'll start with Gladding chapter 3, share a few thoughts there. So overall in chapter 3 with the title being types and functionality of families, the main, I guess, goal for this chapter is that the type of family that you're working with is important to consider. And I think a great place to start from is what type of family did you come from? So being able to, and especially just at the start of the chapter, goes into a few examples of different types of families. I don't think that's an exhaustive list, but think about where you might fit there, or another type of family that you feel like identifies your family structure. Uh, Once again, I'll talk about that a little bit later today in the video, but that starts to kind of help, you know, go into depth of the personal work that's needed in order to engage with various families. So just one quick example or a couple from the list was child-free couples. There was a cohort member of mine in my PhD program who was married but intending to never have children, so just being child-free by choice. And this cohort member had a lot of felt a lot of criticism from people around him, feeling that getting messages that he was what's the word, like selfish and not being thoughtful. Like those are the messages that he felt he was receiving. So like the type of family we come from can bring like a baggage of messages and myths and stereotypes with it. Uh so just something to be thoughtful of. And one addition as well is it talked about multi-generational families, to where there's the child, the parent, and the grandparent, all living in the same home. I think that's going to become, this is just my anecdotal experience, but it seems like that's becoming way more normal now, especially with, housing prices being so much. Uh, and I think COVID led a lot of families to reorganize and regroup beyond just, one generation, uh, to be multi-generational. So that might be something to be important and to be thinking about, of like, what's that family structure like, having three generations in the home, and being able to kind of wrestle with, okay, what are the roles, what are the hierarchies, who has kind of the power in the family to make decisions, how is that negotiated between members. So yeah, another type of family that might be more, I guess, regular depending on where you're at in the country, I think, too. But in my part of the country, in Idaho, actually, there's a lot of people coming to Idaho, and housing prices are still like wild. So I think that's really impacting how families are coping with that, just economically. But then you have to renegotiate that in the family structure. Okay. So just a couple thoughts on your role as the counselor. And I'm jumping around quite a bit. I'm not going to go into tons of details as usual with all these chapters, but just kind of hit on a few key points for each chapter. But obviously, all families are just going to be different, and it's your task as the family counselor to, understand them and work with them from their frame of reference. So you just being thinking about, what makes the family work, what makes the family struggle, uh, and I think a lot of self reflection needs to be there for on our part, of like, what types of families might I feel like really more easily connected to, what might be more challenging to connect to, and why. And we might be off on that too, like buttons might be pushed but in ways that we can't anticipate at this point. I guess the last thing I just call your attention between pages 61 through 66 in the Gladding text, the seventh edition, on the qualities of healthy families. I like how Gladding often emphasizes, the strengths-based and kind of positive psychological perspectives. So I'd encourage you to read through those and kind of see which of those qualities resonates. One that really stood out to me on page 62 from the bullet points is it talked about how having clear roles in the family can be important. I had mixed reactions to that. Of like, do people feel fixated in one place though, and they're like stuck in a role? But I think later on in page 73, it talks about that. But families need coping, strategies as well. And one of those coping strategies on page 73 on the bullet points was, to have role flexibility. So maybe there are clear roles, but when things are hard and difficult, the family, if they're going to cope well, this research that's talked about suggesting that they also need to have some flexibility in that. So not being trapped in a role that's, miserably being trapped in the way of being in the family structure. So there's almost like this tension between, clarity of role, but then also having some flexibility to not be trapped. Last thing with chapter 3 before I move on is on page 64, there's the family reflection, and it talks about ambivalent or ambiguous losses. And I think that can be a really important, especially going into the next chapter on single parenthood and blended families. So ambiguous losses are either where, a member of the family is present, but they're psychologically absent. So maybe like, sure, maybe the father figure is there, but they're not emotionally present. They're just kind of distant and it's cold and not, not emotionally accessible. Or maybe there's someone who's absent in the family, but is very much psychologically present. Maybe that's due to death, or maybe, for military populations, a parent's been called to war. So, like, yeah, they're not physically present in the family, but they're really felt emotionally to be present. So that, and especially due to death, I think that's a very, an important challenge and tension to be able to address and wrestle with. Is that ambiguous loss? Like, okay, their presence is still very much felt, but they're gone. So just something to be thinking about and reflecting on. So with that though, let's go to chapter 4. I'm just jumping to it here. So working with single parent blended families, like I mentioned, single parenthood can look very different. Obviously, every family structure is going to be different and unique. But in the book, I think it's important that it brought up how that single parenthood could be due to divorce, death. It could be a temporary situation, like a call to war, like I mentioned before. You might be able to hear the train going by. I don't know if in the earbuds you can, but I'm hearing it. Okay, honing back in. So yeah, just the type of what led to the single parenthood situation can be really important to consider. But once again, as I mentioned before, Gladden goes into the strengths and the challenges of single parenthood. That there are some, strengths, important things to look at. I think a few that I remember off the top of my head is just like the family tends to be more democratic. I think that's, on page 85, it states that roles and rules are able to be renegotiated and talked about almost out of necessity, just because with the one, like there's no longer two partners playing out roles, so some of those roles that were held by one of the partners is kind of gone and dissolved back. And like, so how is that reorganized back into the family? Who takes over those roles? How's that negotiated? It can be an important process that the family is going through that can be a big part of your role with working with single parenthood families. But yeah, I guess the book talks about this. I'll just kind of highlight it that it can be important to talk about boundary issues. Yeah, with single parenthood families, like I said, if the roles of two partners are no longer there, that one of the partners is gone, it can be hard to like renegotiate. Okay, so the boundaries are going to shift because those roles aren't being played out. And once again, like role clarification is another piece of working with single parenthood families, or can be. I'm not trying to say it must be with every family. So family members might need to like kind of wrestle with their new identity, their new emerging identity, now that an important piece of the family's gone or missing, or the family's just been reorganized in an important way. It's almost like this idea of like the family can, sure, there's a lot of external changes occurring when, there's a single parenthood, like a transition to a single parenthood situation, but there can also be like this inner earthquake. I think particularly for the children, but if there are children, but really for anyone, of this inner earthquake of kind of refinding their identity now that there's been a big shift. And I think, as can be anticipated, that like just navigating big emotional reactions is an important part of kind of the transition to single parenthood as well, and all people in the family. So let's see. One of the last things that I wanted to cover with single parenthood is the idea of parentified children. So that on page 89, it talks about that. So a parentified child is basically a child that has been pulled out of childhood prematurely. So by age or developmental state, they're still in the childhood stage, but just due to maybe just the family changing and shifting, they've been asked, like, you need to now play a more adult-like role, or or a parent type role. This often occurs like if it was a single parenthood family, uh, and the oldest sibling, maybe there's like three or so siblings, the oldest sibling might become parentified because they become a pseudo parent for the others, even though they're still a child. They're a sibling, but they've kind of been raised in status to this parent. So I think that can be really important for individual clients and in working with a family, because a lot of times that parentified child has a lot to work through. Maybe at the time they're okay to take on some of those roles, but in the long run, there can sometimes be bitterness and resentment, of being taken out of childhood, being asked to grow up too quickly. So there can be some lurking feelings like underneath the surface that are there for a while that might surface even later in life. So once again, something really important to be looking for with parentified children. All right. So with blended families, this can be due to divorce, due to death, due to foster care. It can be to, just various ways of families blending and coming together. And once again, look through the strengths as well as the challenges that Gladding brings up. One thing that I did want to address though is the idea on page 91 of when blended families are created due to death. So the blended family, one side of the family, maybe one of the partners died, and so there's a remarriage. So it wasn't due to divorce, but there's a remarriage. And that the person who died can once again be that ambivalent loss. They're not physically present, but they're psychologically present. Uh, so that can be really hard for blended families to work through that. Of like, okay, so let's say that a father died and then there was a remarriage and then there's this new stepfather, and it can be really hard, or maybe even there could be a refusal by the children of saying, no, you're not going to play this new role of my father. He's still not gone, in their mind, and in the influence that the father who died is still having on the family. So that can be really hard to like re-navigate that role of what is that parent figure, how is that navigated for everyone, for the new parent, for the children, how does that renegotiated? So yeah, that emotional presence of the individual who's died can be important to think about and ponder and to help families work through. And I really appreciate on the end of page 91 where it talks about how oftentimes there's death avoidance. That a lot of times families, especially European American families, really kind of push off this idea of death acceptance. There's a lot of just like rituals that can push off the a more full and complete impact of death on the family. So something to be thinking about of like, okay, where might there be some avoidance of being able to navigate and work through loss with the family can be a really significant part, and helping blended families reorganize and come together can be important. So I kind of talked about some of the roles of the counselor in working with blended families, but it can often be that you need to help the family find a new hierarchy. On page 95, it also talks about this ripple effect of unresolved loss. So hence why I was kind of emphasizing the blended family due to death, is that if that's been unresolved, it's going to keep kind of rippling around and everyone's going to feel it in different ways. I think it can become really important to explore loyalties. There might be a real loyalty to the old family, the way the family was, or if in the case of death, like before the parent died, it's almost like for the children, it might be really hard to become loyal to this new family structure because it's almost like if I accept this new family, I'm betraying my father figure who died, sticking with that example, so being able to kind of release from these emotions and these connections in time when the clients are ready and in their own way can kind of help find finding a new loyalty doesn't mean it's a betrayal of an old loyalty, you know, uh, navigating new rules and roles in the family, and as well as making sense of coalitions. I think coalitions are something that we'll keep addressing, but it's almost like subunits in the family where there could be like maybe a sibling and one parent who are like a daughter mother dynamic who could form a coalition to where they're like a team, they're a subunit in the family, but they are, they form the coalition, so they kind of come together sometimes against other family members. Just one small example, and that could be anyone, a father, daughter, uh, whatever partner, whatever family member, that they can form just various arrangements of these subunit coalitions. So, uh, and a lot of times that's not talked about. It's maybe not even super conscious in the family. So your role is to be able to bring that to the consciousness in the family. All right. Uh, Last chapter. Try to keep this one brief. The whole video brief. Okay, so chapter 5 is talking about culturally diverse families, and I already have kind of a significant reaction to that right away because, uh, my belief is that everyone is culturally diverse. We all come from a cultural background. I think obviously sometimes people in dominant culture don't even think about, oh, I don't come from a culture, there's I just am what I am, and that's kind of like this dominant narrative that you don't have to think about culture because it's just infused in every aspect of your life. So I think what really this chapter is talking about is talking about working with minority cultural groups. I think that would be a more accurate way of titling the chapter, just because once again everyone is culturally diverse. We all come from culture. So, in thinking about what is culture on page 106, it talks about a little bit, it kind of lists social identities that can form culture. But I think the core depth of what culture is underneath that list of social identities. So it's on page 106, it talks about collective realities that can kind of form what culture is. These inherited realities from groups and you know individuals that we've been a part of, or and that can lead to, okay, so culture is often connected to deeply rooted traditions, and spoken and unspoken, rules of behavior, or really kind of deeply ingrained patterns as well. It can often just be like conscious and unconscious impacts of how we view the world. uh, I think it's often unquestioned behaviors. It can almost like connect to this idea of morality, of what is right. Culture can often influence and kind of train us subliminally, of kind of what is the correct way, and what worldview. So those are some, I think, the deeper levels of what culture is and its impact. And uh, I think a big task for us as counselors then is like we need to be aware of our cultural background and experiences so that we're not imposing it, especially with culture being a lot of the elements of what is right and true in the world, what is rules of behavior. That's going to be dependent upon culture. So we need to be thoughtful of, okay, where do I come from? How have I been culturally trained to hold certain beliefs and perspectives and to see behaviors in a certain light, and how can I not impose that on my clients? Uh, so this is a deep work and it takes time, and I hope this is infused in all of your coursework and all of your experiences at Adams State. uh, but something really important to think about when working with a family, though, is like, the family is going to have its own unique experience of culture as well. We can't just make assumptions based on you know race or ethnicity, sexual orientation of certain members in the family, that they're going to be a certain way. They're going to have their unique expression of culture. So we need to be attuned to how can we attend to the cultural experience of the unique family that's in front of us. All right. And it's a few things to address specifically when working with clients who come from minority cultural backgrounds is there can often be uh, you know a lack of feeling of belonging, or social exclusion that might need to be worked through in the family. It can be this identity: who am I as a person, who am I in my family, and how does the larger culture see me? It's almost like caught between two worlds, where at home I'm this way, but then out in the dominant culture I'm this way. Like, so there's this idea of identity of like, who am I? Uh, and it's particularly important to work through any sense of inner lack of acceptance of them, of the family as a cultural group. Uh, let's see. Yeah, so there can also be expectations, obviously, from the larger dominant culture of what's best, or how the family should function, and that might not connect at all for the family unit's minority culture perspective. So once again, we need to be really thoughtful of how the dominant cultural narrative influences the lived experience of the family that we're working with, and then what is that family culture like internally, experience internally. Okay, well, I guess the last thing that I wanted to mention to keep the video a bit more brief is just really quick on the REBT video. So this video, there's a clinical demonstration, but it's still just working with one family member. So we're not seeing the full family together yet. That'll come later in the term. But it does begin to demonstrate some important things about thinking systemically. So you're going to be able to see some examples of feedback loops that's talking about kind of like how the family's functioning, and how there's this pattern of behavior and how the family functions. And I think that leads into this circular causality. And I think, the video starts to give a good idea of like, how can we disrupt a negative circularly causal experience by changing one member of the family. That can start to shift the whole system. So I think it starts to show, once again, working with an individual, but with a systemic lens, and you can start to see that. But it's also coming from rationally motive behavior therapeutic approach as well. So some good kind of hands-on ways of seeing the work done. All right. Well, if you have any questions on this or need to connect, I'd be happy to. But yeah, take me up on the office hours. I'd be happy to chat with you. Thanks.